Hey everyone, it's Sevi. In the same patch as Kazuha, we're also finally getting Yoimiya's first rerun, and, well, there's a lot to talk about. I recall how Yoimiya was met with divisive reception before and after her release. She was criticized for having ICD issues, auto-targeting issues, and a confusing kit, to name a few. But we've been given almost a year to put her through many challenges and explore her limitations and potential. So how do her criticisms then hold up now? Is she really as bad as she was made out to be? I want to address those points in this video by going through the pros and cons of her kit. The cons especially to see how much you should be wary of them, how big of an issue they really are, and how you can deal with them. My goal isn't to convince you whether Yoimiya is worth pulling or not, as I see her more as a want than need to pull character. Honestly, if you're pulling her because she's this cute, bubbly, joyful character, then based. Just do it. I fell for her character design and personality at first sight too, but I want to be objective about her as well, and so this video is to better understand Yoimiya's strengths and weaknesses. Let's get into it. Yoimiya was made to fill in a niche role of being a single-target pyro DPS, and this led to stiff competition and comparisons with other pyro DPSs. A major competitor was the powerful 4-star Xiangling, and when compared in scenarios that favor AoE damage output, Yoimiya falls noticeably short. Against enemy mobs, Yoimiya will have to spend more time picking them off one by one and switching targets, compared to a single or dual boss fight where Yoimiya can easily focus fire. Hu Tao was also another unavoidable comparison as a fellow single-target pyro DPS. And given an equal level of investment, Hu Tao outperforms Yoimiya in single-target scenarios. However, the difference isn't far off, and Yoimiya offers something that can be more valuable than damage output, which is convenience. This is because Yoimiya is very easy to use and requires little to no mechanical skill to master. In contrast, Hu Tao has a certain optimal playstyle that requires consistent attack cancelling, which some players are not up for. And if you can't accomplish that, then there is a possibility for Yoimiya to outdamage. Yoimiya is just pew-pew gameplay simplicity. For mobile players, that might be valuable. Or even if it's on a controller or keyboard, maybe you just prefer that style. Yoimiya is ranged, however, so in certain scenarios that require reach, she at least has that better covered than either Hu Tao or Xiangling. This has been a big help for me against bosses that fly around, particularly the Wolf Lord or PMA and Abyss floors. Anyway, Xiangling and Hu Tao are high standards to be compared to, and if we interpret that Yoimiya being not as good as them in certain scenarios means that Yoimiya is just plain bad, that would be the wrong takeaway. Yoimiya has the firepower to boast strong damage and, if applied properly, is an exceptionally good single-target DPS. You have to keep in mind the limitations of her playstyle to use her in well-suited situations. But there are more nuances and potential caveats to unpack about her kit. The first caveat I'll bring up has to do with her being the most prominent spam-click archer in the game. Except for a physical official, so far no one else relies heavily on their actual bow auto-attacks as much as Yoimiya does. But with that comes the woes of her attacks auto-target. Now, this isn't a new or exclusive problem. It's an issue that can arise with bow users, but it became much more pronounced with Yoimiya because, as a single-target DPS, for even one of her arrows to misfire is a noticeable frustration. When does it become evident? Sissenflies, for example, can make your attacks unintentionally prioritize them over the mages, and your hits miss when they dart around. Or Magukenki when he suddenly teleports. On an overload team, when light enemies get thrown around, this increases the likelihood of her arrows missing. Enemies with large hitboxes don't have this problem, as there's a lot of surface area for her hits to connect with, but small hitbox enemies are a bigger challenge to her auto-targeting. It's understandably frustrating. But over the time I've regularly used her, my personal experience has resulted in me only rarely encountering such auto-targeting issues. Most of it also probably has to do with me using her mainly as a boss-killing unit, and in such cases, it's very rare to miss her hits with them. Her attack range is also the regular range with other archer units. Yanfei was compared as having a slightly longer range than Yoimiya, but in practical experience, Yoimiya's range will be adequate for battles. Even with flying enemies like PMA or Wolf Lord, her range is still sufficient. To ensure that her auto-targeting does not mess up, the simplest solution is to play her in close range, which might seem like it defeats the whole purpose of her being an archer, but hey, it gets you the best results. In such cases, having a shield becomes more important, which I'll get to later. Unfortunately, the same auto-targeting and range problems can potentially manifest in her burst too. Oftentimes, as long as your enemy stays below you, it'll land with no problem. But if the target enemy moves out of the AoE in some instances, it can just completely miss landing on an enemy. I've gotten around this just by making sure to cast it when I can ensure the target is stationary. Again, Hoyoverse has overall room for improvement in this auto-targeting system, as this isn't exclusive to Yoimiya, and other archers will experience them too. To address this requires a more general fix, but I can say that Yoimiya's auto-targeting fails are more of nuisances than a deal breaker. Moving on, most of her damage comes from her infused normal attacks, and here's another source of Yoimiya cons. Due to the progression of her attack multipliers and timer on Pyro Infusion, you generally want to land the biggest damage dealing hits of her normal attack sequence. This becomes more important when you factor in her ICD in a vaporized team. Back then, many criticized her for having standard ICD as if it were the deal breaker in her kit, which I don't think is true at all and was mainly thrown around as a misunderstood mechanic, so we have to set the record straight. Yoimiya's attack sequence, if anything, actually accommodates the standard ICD counter. The third and fifth hit of her attacks are her strongest multipliers, and when she's used in a vaporized team, these are the hits you want to trigger vaporize with to deal the biggest damage. If you complete her 5-hit sequence consecutively, which is generally how she's supposed to be played, her ICD is set up such that these are the hits that will vaporize. Let me demonstrate. In this test on the Regis-Vine, if I do her full combo consecutively, you can see that the third and fifth hit of the sequence consistently vaporized. The same is true in this Magu Kenki test. Notice that the third and fifth hit did a crit hit and vaporized all 3 times. For a last demo, even if I run her with Yunjin's attack speed buff, this still holds true. However, this comes with certain conditions. It assumes that you can apply Hydro consistently enough, but that's easily addressed by running her with Xingqiu, Yelan, or both, who are required for her vaporized team anyway. It also matters less if you're using Yoimiya in an exclusively overload team, as overload damage does not scale on your attack's damage, unlike vaporize. This also assumes that nothing will interrupt your attack sequence or slow you down, such as being affected by cryo. However, Yoimiya is prone to getting staggered or interrupted, and if that happens, you lose out on a lot of potential damage. This is the part that requires particular teammates to address. Now, what if something happens that ruins the sequences, causing you to miss out on those timed vaporize hits? Well, it's not the end of the world. Just keep doing your rotation normally, as Yoimiya will still do damage, or restart your run in Spiral Abyss if it's that crucial. Chances are, whatever you're trying to clear will still be cleared normally even with such mistakes. But basically, I hope this explains the quote-unquote issues of ICD that Yoimiya really faces and how it doesn't make her inherently bad. Rather, it just makes her a unit with regular considerations. So, as I mentioned, running a shield or ability that provides resistance to interruption is almost mandatory on her. It feels really vulnerable playing Yoimiya without a shielder, as her low defense and HP make her very squishy, and again, having to dodge frequently breaks her attack sequences. Thankfully, 2 of her best teammates, Xingqiu and Beidou, while not being dedicated shielders, actually provide her with interruption resistance. Still, nothing beats a dedicated shielder, and the best is none none other than Zhongli. If you actually have him, then getting interrupted is mostly a thing of the past, and he'll give the guaranteed thick protection Yoimiya needs, especially against tanking big hits of certain bosses. But what if you don't have him? Your next best options are 4 stars Diona, Tank Fei, or Toma, who have their own caveats to deal with. Unfortunately, they're just not as good as Zhongli's shielding capabilities. Getting them to have acceptable shield thickness and uptime will cost more hyper-investing into their HP and ER stats. Does this mean she's stealing these teammates from your other potential teams? The good news is, Hoyoverse is consistently and frequently giving us more and more characters to play with, so I honestly think team building will become less of an issue over time. I'll admit, there is one part of Yoimiya's kit that feels completely wasted, and that's her charged attack. There's no incentive to use it due to its slow wind-up time and poor damage payoff. It's sadder seeing how Yelan's charged shot mechanic works, and that it can be incorporated in our rotations if we wanted to. Having Yoimiya's charged attack function like Yelan's would have made it so much more feasible. Another major contention is her burst, which is often viewed as near useless. But is it really that bad? While it's her only inherent AoE damage source, it seems to deal little damage, and the AoE isn't even that big. But taken advantage of, it can actually compose around 20% of her total personal damage. Another requirement though is that another unit needs to proc it. While this condition is oddly limiting, it isn't that big of a problem due to how Yoimiya will be played and who you would naturally comp her with. And it comes with an additional utility. Casting her burst gives an attack buff to your teammates that reaches up to 20% attack, which is significant for team DPS. But note that Yoimiya will not get the buff, which is quite unfortunate, so it's really meant to support others. Arguably, that's the more important part of her burst. And so its optimal usage is casting it before rotating through your team's abilities, which some of them, like Fischl or Beidou, will be able to proc while attacking and will also snapshot the attack buff. So the burst's uptime is the time that your teammates are meant to be rotating in their skills to set up their abilities before Yoimiya's DPS window, and it matters less that Yoimiya can't proc it herself. But I've noticed that some of Yoimiya's new teammates, such as Yelan and Yunjin, don't really benefit from that attack buff much, or even at all due to their scaling mechanics. We'll see moving forward if future potential Yoimiya teammates will have that characteristic, but as of now, Yoimiya still has several teammates to whom her buff is advantageous. So given all that, is it really worth using her burst? The argument that will get thrown around is this. Having to integrate Yoimiya's burst in her team rotation means that you'll have to build enough ER on her, which might come at the expense of her attack and crit stats. It'll also anti-synergize with 4-piece Shimenawa, hence it's not worth reducing Yoimiya's personal normal attack damage to use her burst. However, time and math have already proven that 1. The attack bonus gain that Yoimiya can contribute to her team DPS gain can make up for her personal DPS loss. 2. The damage she loses from her normal attacks that goes to having consistent burst uptime is also compensated enough. 3. A 4-piece Shimenawa build, despite the hefty buff it gives to normal attacks, is not necessarily her best overall set as it hinders her from using her kit's full potential. Yes, the 4-piece Shimenawa isn't the top recommended set for her, and it might be a hard pill to swallow as it seems like it's technically made for her. The perception that her burst is useless also reinforced the idea of using a 4-piece Shimenawa despite its energy drain. To be clear, Yoimiya on Shimenawa is not a weak or horrible build. If you've already farmed a full decent set, you can slap it on her and she'll still clear the toughest content. But ultimately, it actually limits Yoimiya's full potential. Fortunately, we can reassess such conceptions, and I hope the previous points helped with that. It's freeing and better to explore more convenient 2-piece options, since that can even likely yield better substats than forcing a 4-piece set while removing the energy drain. It can improve Yoimiya's damage and team synergy. But if you still choose the Shimenawa set despite knowing this, then at least you're making a more conscious decision. Now that we've laid out these prominent concerns and misconceptions about Yoimiya's kit, it might seem like Yoimiya has more cons than pros to her. Do I wish for some quality of life changes? Sure. Is she a meta-defining character? I wouldn't say so. But does she do what I expect her to do? Definitely. And when she's at her best, it's fireworks. In Spiral Abyss, over the cycle since her release, I've almost always brought Yoimiya in whenever the chamber demanded a DPS check, whether Kenki or PMA or what have you. Abyss floors have shown more variety since then, but DPS check chambers are almost certain to return every now and then. What about outside of Spiral Abyss? Well, there are plenty of bosses in the open world and domains too. I mean, you have to frequently farm bosses whenever you want to raise a new character. And it's not even just bosses. She's great for the open world, makes those annoying specters a lot less annoying, and is still a solid character in my opinion. There's lots of areas in the game where Yoimiya can still shine. All that said, Yoimiya clearly is not a must-pull. If you've played the game long enough, you know that DPSs are relatively replaceable, and it's often the supports that really have longevity. Yoimiya has many alternatives among Pyro DPSs and just among DPS characters in general. But ultimately, I think she's proven to be a character who's more than her flaws. That's going to be all for this video, everyone. Let me know in the comments what you think about Yoimiya. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel for more Genshin Impact guides and content, and I will see you all soon. Take care!